All right, guys, welcome to Standard 4.5. Today we're going to talk a little bit about urbanization in the late 1800s. That means how cities grew and attracted lots and lots of people. There's some pretty simple concepts in here, so I think we can move right into this, and it should be pretty easy. Number of things we talked about in class here. By the way, I will mention this. If you have not yet seen the little section I do about political cartoons and how to think through those, it would be really good if you would come and talk to me, because you will see a number of political cartoons both on the test that I give and the EOC at the end of the year. So make sure you talk to me about that, because I want to make sure that you are well prepared. We will do some more in class though, okay? All right, so the first question is, how did cities grow in the first place? Well, originally cities were not just things. It wasn't like people were just walking around out in the natural frontier and decided, I'm going to put a city here. It seems like a really good idea. No, cities would originally grow because there was a center of trade there. A lot of times there was like a river, there may have been a railroad stop, something, and everybody said, okay, this is where I go to buy stuff, this is where I go to sell stuff. And of course you want to live near the place where you work, and so here's your center of trade, and around here you have your basically the city and the outskirts of where people live. As the trade networks grow, and what I mean by that is as there are more ways to get goods and resources there to the city, that could be a canal that's dug, it could be railroads we've brought to that city. Cities are going to grow because now you've got more stores there, you've got more places to buy and sell, you've got more people who want to buy and sell there. Well, this is all great, but we have some normal natural barriers. Like if you have a river, you probably can't live on the other side of that river because it's hard to cross, until we come up with new innovations in transportation like bridges, or until we start to have subways. Well, the subway's great because now I can live pretty far away from where I work and I can just take the subway in every day. So that makes life a lot easier. It mentions there the L's. The L is Chicago's elevated train. You may have seen, it's kind of their version of a subway, but it runs more above ground than underground. So this allows people, like it says, to live farther from work, and so cities are going to grow outward. But even with this, you've got a limit, because I don't want to live, 100 miles from the center of the city. So we've got to figure out how else can we pack people into these cities. Well, that innovation is going to come around with really two things. It only mentions one here, but there are two. One is the elevator that allows us to grow upward. I can now live on the 20th floor and without having to walk up the stairs, and that makes life much more livable. So not only the elevator, though, steel is also going to be huge, because without the steel skeleton in these buildings, you cannot have 20, 30-story buildings. So now we're growing out, we're growing up, and the cities are just attracting lots and lots of people. Say, who does it attract? Well, immigrants, people coming in from other parts of the world, realize they need to go to a city because they want jobs. There are farmers, like we talked about in the last section, whose crops have not been enough to help them survive. And so they're now going to go to the cities to try to find a new living there in industry. Some people just move because they're bored. Okay, there's more culture in the city. There's more excitement in the city. You can live in the countryside, or you can live in, like Times Square is what you see here. Clearly, the one on the right is going to be a little more interesting than the life on the left. Now, even though this is true and lots of people are moving there, most people in the United States still lived outside of cities until 1920. So there are a lot of people in rural areas. We have a lot of agriculture, but today, that's clearly because it's after 1920, today you can see that most people live in cities, okay? Now, one particular movement that you ought to know about is something called the Great Migration. You see here some African Americans who are moving somewhere. Well, I'll tell you where they're probably going and why as we talk about the Great Migration. See, the Great Migration is a period of time in the early 1900s when African Americans moved from the South to cities in the North. And there are a number of reasons that they would move. One is that the cotton crop that they've relied on now for a number of years is just not coming in like it used to. There are some reasons for that. One is something called soil exhaustion. They keep using up the same dirt to grow the same crop year after year, and so some of the nutrients are getting sucked out of the soil by these cotton plants. On top of that, this bug you see in the picture is called the boll weevil. The boll weevil would basically eat up the cotton plant, or a good chunk of it, and ruin entire crops. So if you depend on cotton to survive, these two things are making it so you're getting less and less of a cotton yield every year. So why are you going to stay? Because you are still living, remember, in the South. We've got Jim Crow. There's all kinds of intimidation. You can't vote, remember, we're going to come and visit you, that kind of a thing. There are lynchings. People are being beaten. People are being hanged. There's not a lot of reason to stay. And so first, a lot of African Americans moved to southern cities. So if you live out in rural South Carolina, you might go to Greenville, you might go to Spartanburg, or you might go to Columbia. But after some time, you start to realize I'm not getting a job here because there are still racists around me. Okay, so the Jim Crow laws are going to prevent people from getting work. A lot of African Americans then start to move to the west, to the north. They go to the Midwest. They're going all over the country, anywhere they think they can find work. And of course, they're going to go to cities because cities are the places where they have the most job opportunities. Now, even though that's true, once they get to the north, that doesn't mean that suddenly they've reached the promised land and life is wonderful, because there's still racism. They're the last ones to get a job. They're the first ones to get fired. The only jobs they can definitely get occur when there's a strike. They're willing to go in and be a strike breaker. Remember we talked about scabs, people who would be willing to work during a strike. African Americans said, I need a job, I'll do it. Well, this is not going to be good for race relations, though, because if you think about it, you have people who are already a little bit racist who are on strike. It's the North in the late 1800s, early 1900s, so there's going to be racism. It's a fact. And then you see some black people going and taking the job that used to be yours. Is that going to help you love people who are of a different color than you? Well, of course not. Okay, so this is going to feed racism in the North in the early 1900s. Now, eventually, World War I breaks out. We'll talk about that in the next standard. When World War I breaks out, a lot of the white males move over to go fight the war. And so a lot of African Americans say, whoa, jobs. And so more people are going to come from the South to the North to get jobs. After World War I, the soldiers come back. They want their jobs back. And so they're going to lose a lot of that. But you have this other phenomenon where you get large bunches of African Americans living in a very small community, a lot of them in places like Harlem. Harlem is where they were attracted at first because the rent was a little bit cheaper. They didn't have a lot of money coming out of the South because, well, for a multitude of reasons. So they get there and they start to talk amongst themselves, and they now realize that their experience is not only theirs. What I mean by that is you get guys who say, boy, I remember hearing stories that my grandma used to tell about, the master on her plantation just being horrible and awful. And they say, my grandmother told similar stories. Or I remember sharecropping as a boy, and here's what it was like for me. Well, these conversations start to flow into art. So what they'll do is they'll start to say, boy, remember that story we talked about? That was great. I'm going to write about that now. I'm going to write a poem, Langston Hughes, for example. I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a play. I'm going to paint a picture. And so you get this rebirth of black culture in America that we call the Harlem Renaissance. This is where it comes from. Now, African Americans aren't the only folks who are moving to the cities in the North. Immigrants are definitely coming, but that's not a new phenomenon. You see, really since the beginning of the United States, we've had immigrants coming, but there is a shift. You see, in the 1700s, the early 1800s, most of them are from Western Europe. They're from Ireland, they're from England, they're from Germany, possibly. Even then, though, a lot of these guys are looked down on. So you see the sign here, help wanted, no Irish need apply. So there's still a little bit of racism, okay? But it's about to get worse because after the Civil War, most of the immigrants are going to now be from the South and from Eastern Europe. Okay, this is going to be people from Poland. It's going to be people from Italy, Russian Jews. And you might realize, if you think about it, that these people are not typically people who are going to speak a lot of English. They're not people who have a very Western European way of life. And so this is going to change the culture of the United States. And this is not something that Americans have typically done very well with. You see, we see all these new folks coming in, and we say, whoa, no, 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 no. The United States should just be for white European, Western European style Americans. So you have a movement called nativism. Nativism basically says the government should limit immigration so that white Americans stay in the majority. And they said Native Americans should stay in the majority. But that's crazy, because if you think about it, Native Americans are not Western Europeans. Native Americans are what is sometimes called the American Indian. So for them to say we don't want people coming in and changing the culture, well, they just did that, in the last 100, 150, 200 years. Okay, so this is kind of an odd thing. After the Civil War, though, with more and more people coming in from other countries, you're going to see more nativism, and you get political cartoons like this one. We've got Uncle Sam at the door who's blocking this guy who's some kind of an immigrant, says he's bringing poverty, he's bringing disease, he's desecrating the Sabbath. In other words, it's alcohol, so they're saying he's going to drink on Sunday. Anarchy. This is not something we should allow. We should stop these guys at the gates. This is another political cartoon from the time where you have a guy who is the WASP. WASP stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Anglo-Saxon meaning he's derived his ancestry from England. Okay. Then down at the bottom you see what we would like to see. What we want to see is this is probably a Russian Jew. We want to throw him back to Russia. And you see a Chinese guy. This is a very, very racist stereotype here. We want to throw him back to China. Okay, this is nuts. But this is the kind of thing that you saw all over the place in the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Well, because of the fact that immigrants aren't being welcomed into the United States with open arms, immigrants would often stay in a port city where they landed. And usually that means immigrants, and by the way, this is on the test, so you might want to star this. Most of these immigrants are going to stay in the east and in the north because that's where most of the jobs were. That's where most of them landed. They're going to live in towns close together, or little, referred to as ghettos often, like Little Italy or Greektown or Polonia. So you live in a place that speaks your language and cooks your food and dresses like you do. So this is a phenomenon that still exists. You can still go visit Chinatown, for example. The reason these people went there was usually that's where they could find acceptance. People weren't going to look at Polish people in Polonia like they were some kind of second-class citizen, because everybody was from Poland there. If you'd been there longer, you'd help the new folks. Cultural norms were going to thrive. I just kind of mentioned that. Now, this brings up one particular issue. That is that immigrants tended to vote for anybody who would help them out when they were having a hard time. Well, people start to realize this, and so you get these men called political bosses. These are guys who sort of ran the politics for an entire city. And they said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to start to help immigrants as soon as they get off the boat. We're going to find them a place to live, a place to sleep, a place to work. And then we're going to come back around election time after they've gotten their citizenship, and we're going to say, hey, you should vote for my boss. And then either the Democrats or the Republicans would start to get lots and lots of votes. These are the political bosses. Okay? You see up at the top that term again, political bosses and machines. The idea of a machine is that there are lots of working parts. So the boss would have somebody who would find a place for these guys to live, and he'd find somebody else that would hire them, and he'd find somebody else who would actually go around and say, okay, now here's who you need to vote for. So there are all these moving parts in support of a particular political party. Now, these machines would solve problems for the people in these local areas, okay? And some of them are actually really needed because nobody was looking out for these guys, okay? Nobody was looking out for the immigrants. Some of them, on the other hand, are going to be very corrupt. Like Boss Tweed is one boss in particular who in today's money would be a billionaire. He gets that money by basically asking immigrants to collect more money from their employer than they should. Like he'd say, hey, that bench that's worth about $50, charge $200 for it, and then give me the extra money. Of course they're going to do it because Boss Tweed helped them out. Okay. Not all these guys, again, though, are bad. Some of them are very, very necessary. Whew, man, almost got it. 15 minutes limit. We're at 14:33 right now. Hey, if you have any questions, you can email me at ngallion@greermiddlecollege.org. I hope this has been helpful to you. See you next time.